Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Frank, and I'm the Senior Assistant Director of Financial Aid for the Office of Student Financial Aid here at George Mason University. As you may have heard, the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA, introduced a lot of changes to the form for the 24-25 aid year. If this is the first time you're hearing about these changes, that's perfectly fine, because I'm going to give you an overview of all of them right now. Let's get started. So Mason's Office of Student Financial Aid, or OSFA, has been hard at work preparing for the updated FAFSA. We've made resources like this webinar available on our website, gmu.edu/financial aid, to help you understand the full scope of the new application. Today, we're going to go over what's changed, what stayed the same, when your FAFSA is due, and where you can learn more if you still have questions. We'll also talk a bit about how you can access aid if you're ineligible for the FAFSA toward the end of the video. So feel free to jump to that portion if you already know that's where you need to be. So what's changing? A lot, actually. There have been changes to how the application works, as well as how aid eligibility is calculated. We'll go over both in this video. But before we get into it, it's important to understand a little bit about why the FAFSA changed this year. The FAFSA changed due to the FAFSA Simplification Act passed by Congress. According to the Department of Education, the goal of this act was to create a more streamlined application that also expands access to federal student aid. So how has the application been streamlined? Well, the application has been made more dynamic, meaning the applicants will now have to answer fewer questions overall. Federal tax information will now also be transferred directly from the IRS to your FAFSA, meaning you won't have to enter it onto your application. Once you complete your portion of the FAFSA, you'll also be able to monitor the progress of your application, including any updates made by your contributors. Speaking of contributors, this is one of the most important changes to the FAFSA. Contributor is a new term introduced for the 24-25 FAFSA, and it refers to anyone who is required to provide information, consent, approval, and a signature on a student's FAFSA. We'll talk more about what some of those terms mean in a moment, but we first want to understand who counts as a contributor. Who a student's contributors are is determined by the student's dependency, tax filing, and marital status. This means that depending on your situation, your contributors could include the student's biological or adoptive parent, the student's step-parent, or the student's spouse. It's really important to note that being a contributor does not mean a person is financially responsible for a student's costs. Even so, they still have to complete their portion of the student's FAFSA. Now, once you have a sense of who your contributors are, let's talk about what they'll need to do. A contributor has to do a couple things to help a student complete their FAFSA. In order, these are: 1. They need to create an FSA ID. This is the account information they'll use to log into studentaid.gov. Each contributor has to create their own account. Each FSA ID uses verified information that is linked to one person, so they cannot use a student's account or another contributor's account. 2. They need to give consent and approval on the FAFSA. Giving both of these things means a contributor agrees to have their federal tax information, or FTI, used to help determine a student's aid eligibility. This is the information imported directly from the IRS, and because of the changes to the application, this is a required part of the process. Finally, once a contributor has created their account and consented and approved to share their FTI, they will need to sign the student's FAFSA. Every contributor to a student's FAFSA has to complete these steps in a timely manner once the process is started. Without participation, consent and approval, and signatures from all contributors, a student will not be eligible for federal student aid. And if the FAFSA form is left incomplete and inactive for 45 days, it will be automatically deleted and must be completed again by all contributors. So we've talked about how completing the FAFSA is different this year, but there's also a big change to how the FAFSA works. That change is in what tool is used to calculate your aid eligibility. Previously, the FAFSA relied on your expected family contribution, or EFC, to calculate your aid. Now the FAFSA will use your Student Aid Index, or SAI number. But what does that mean exactly? Well, for prospective and current Mason students, it means a few different things. For most, this means an increase in aid eligibility, including increased access to Pell Grants for most students and a larger income protection allowance. For some, this might decrease aid eligibility, including the removal of benefits for having siblings in college and the requirement to report the value of family farms and small businesses. But no matter how aid eligibility changes, the FAFSA is still your best means for accessing federal, state, and institutional aid at Mason. Let me tell you why. The state of Virginia and Mason use your FAFSA for all of our aid calculations. In addition to federal aid, the FAFSA determines your eligibility for state-specific aid. It also helps Mason review your eligibility for aid that we offer, including institutional grants and scholarships. Because of this, Mason students are required to complete the FAFSA every year they are enrolled to be eligible and considered for aid. We know completing the FAFSA can be difficult, but trust us, it's well worth it because aid is available. That's why 67% of Mason students receive some form of financial aid. Now, when is the FAFSA actually due? Even with the late open date, early completion of the FAFSA is still really valuable. Some aid is awarded on a first-come, first-served basis, so early applications are considered before later applications for these limited funds. In order to be eligible for aid like this, you should try to submit your FAFSA by our priority deadline, which has been updated to account for the later opening date of this year's FAFSA. Our priority deadline for all undergraduate students is March 1. If you miss your priority deadline, don't worry. There's still aid for which you may be eligible. Just submit your FAFSA as early as you can. Now, before we go, let's talk about what you should do if you are ineligible for the FAFSA. Virginia residents who are ineligible for the FAFSA should complete the Virginia Alternative State Aid Application, or VASA, instead of the FAFSA. This includes those who are undocumented or have DACA status. If this is your situation, you should complete the VASA to be considered for state and institutional aid. We hope that answers some of your questions, but if you have more, there are a lot of resources available on our website and the Federal Student Aid website. There's also a whole series of videos available on the Federal Student Aid YouTube channel. There are even Spanish language versions of several of these resources. Above all, remember that the OSFA and everyone at Mason is here to help you navigate this process. Once again, my name is Dan Frank, and I look forward to seeing you on campus.